The boy stood in the doorway of Grayson's roadside tavern, barefoot in a blizzard, wrapped in nothing but a thin facility sweatshirt and the determination that this was his last chance at survival. For 11 months, Ethan Michael Cartwright had endured what Pastor Richard Thornwell called biblical discipline. For 11 months, he'd lost 31 pounds to systematic starvation. For 11 months, he'd tried to tell someone, anyone, that children were suffering inside Shepherd's Path Youth Reformation Center. But what happened in the next 4 hours would prove that sometimes the system doesn't save you. Sometimes, a stranger wearing leather and patches does. This is Ethan's story. And the part nobody saw coming, the recording hidden in his waistband that would bring down a pastor, expose a multi-million-dollar fraud, and mobilize 147 Hells Angels in the middle of a Nebraska winter storm. Quick pause. Subscribe and drop your location below. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Please, they said God sent the storm to test me, but I know God didn't do this. The words came out in a whisper, half-frozen breath visible in the warm tavern air, as 14-year-old Ethan Cartwright collapsed just inside the door. His legs, weakened from months of malnutrition, finally gave out. Snow from his makeshift foot wrappings melted into dark puddles on the wood floor. Marcus Hammer Sullivan was out of his booth before conscious thought took over. 6'3" of muscle and leather crossed the room in 4 long strides. The 51-year-old Marine veteran dropped to one knee in front of the collapsed teenager. His scarred hands, gentle despite their size, reached for the kid's shoulders. "Kid, I don't know who they are," Hammer said, his voice low and steady. "But you're right. God didn't do this. Men did. And men answer for that. You're safe now." He shrugged off his leather jacket without hesitation and wrapped it around Ethan's shaking frame. Behind him, the other 14 Hells Angels in the bar had gone completely silent. The jukebox still played something by Johnny Cash, but nobody was listening anymore. "Bartender," Hammer called over his shoulder, never taking his eyes off the kid. "Call 911. Get blankets, now." Ethan's teeth chattered so hard he could barely speak. His hands, red and swollen from early-stage frostbite, clutched at the jacket like it was the first warm thing he'd felt in months. Which investigators would later discover, it basically was. The bartender, a woman named Carol who'd worked at Gray's for 23 years, grabbed the phone with shaking hands. She'd seen plenty of things in this roadside bar: fights, drunks, bikers who looked dangerous but mostly kept to themselves. But a half-frozen teenager stumbling in from a blizzard looking like he'd been starved? That was new. "Where'd you come from, son?" another biker asked. This one was older, maybe late 50s, with crow's feet around his eyes and a road name patch that read Crow. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who'd seen too much in his own childhood. Ethan's breath came in short gasps. Shepherd's Path, the youth center, 2 miles east on Redemption Road. Hammer's jaw tightened. He knew that place. Everyone in Custer County knew Shepherd's Path Youth Reformation Center. Pastor Richard Thornwell ran it. Good Christian man, everyone said, helping troubled teens, doing God's work. But looking at this kid, hollow-cheeked, bruised, hypothermic in the middle of a record-breaking blizzard, Hammer's instincts from 2 combat tours told him something was very, very wrong. "How long you been there?" Hammer asked quietly. 11 months. Ethan's voice cracked. "My parents, they sent me because I skipped school twice. They thought I needed discipline, structure. Pastor Thornwell promised he'd help me." The kid's face was dirty, cheeks sunken from weight loss that no 14-year-old should experience. dark circles under hazel eyes that still held fight, despite obvious exhaustion. A small scar above his right eyebrow. Hammer recognized that kind of mark. The kind you got from falling when someone made sure you fell. Crow moved closer, kneeling on Ethan's other side. "Son, you saying they hurt you there?" What came out next was like a dam breaking. "1 meal a day if we're good," Ethan said, words tumbling over each other. "Sometimes nothing for days if Pastor says we're too prideful. No heat in our rooms. He says the cold teaches us to depend on God. There's 8 of us kids there. We're so hungry. All the time." His breath hitched. His hands, those red, swollen hands, gripped Hammer's jacket tighter. "I tried to tell people. Teachers. Church people. Even a state inspector who came to check on us. Nobody believed me. Pastor Thornwell is... Everyone trusts him. He's a pastor. They think we're just bad kids lying." Behind Hammer, the other bikers had formed a semicircle. 14 men in leather and denim, covered in road dust and patches, standing completely still. Listening. Not one of them interrupted. Because they all knew what it meant when a kid tried to tell adults something was wrong and nobody listened. Hammer's hands, those same hands that had held M16s in the Gulf War, that had buried his younger brother after the kid killed himself at 16, because nobody protected him from his foster father. Those hands stayed gentle on this stranger's shoulders. "Ethan," he said. The kid had mentioned his name between gasping breaths. "Look at me." Hollow hazel eyes met Hammer's pale blue ones. "How many kids still in there?" 7. 7 others. Ethan's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "If he finds out I ran, if he knows someone helped me, he'll hurt them. He always does when someone tries to tell." The bartender came over with 3 wool blankets. Another biker, younger guy, maybe mid-40s, patch reading Wire, was already on his phone pulling up information. His face went tight as he read something on his screen. "Boss," Wire said quietly. "Shepherd's Path Youth Reformation Center. State-licensed behavioral rehabilitation facility. Faith-based. Run by Pastor Richard Allen Thornwell. Been operating for 3 years. Contract with the state for at-risk youth placement." Hammer didn't look away from Ethan. "Licensed. Of course it is." That's when Ethan reached into his waistband with shaking hands. He pulled out a plastic bag. Inside was an old smartphone. "I found this," he whispered. "In a storage closet. I hid it, recorded them talking. Pastor Thornwell saying we need to stay longer so he can make boat payments. His wife saying the cold is fine because nobody dies. Him threatening us before inspections." His eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back. "I have proof, but he's coming back tonight. If he finds me gone, finds out I have this, please, you have to believe me. The other kids..." Hammer took the bag carefully. He looked at the phone through the plastic, looked back at this 14-year-old's face, terrified, exhausted, still thinking about 7 other children when he'd just run 2.7 miles barefoot through a blizzard to save himself. Something shifted in the room. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. Snow piled against the glass in drifts that would make most roads impassable by morning. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees with a wind chill that felt like -24. Perfect weather for staying inside. Bad weather for riding motorcycles. Hammer stood to his full height. He looked at his brothers, all 14 of them, watching, waiting. He didn't need to say anything. They all nodded. He turned back to Ethan. "Listen to me, son. We're not leaving those kids there one more night. We're not waiting for the system that already failed you. Storm or no storm, we ride." He crouched back down to Ethan's level. "Cops are coming for you right now. They'll get you warm and safe. But that place? That pastor?" Hammer's voice dropped to something harder, colder than the blizzard outside. "We're handling that. You did the hard part. You survived and you got help. Now let us do what we do." Hammer extended his hand, palm up, open, asking permission. When Ethan placed his freezing hand in Hammer's calloused palm, Hammer closed his fingers gently, held for 3 seconds, then placed his other hand on top. "You have my word." Behind him, every other biker in that roadside tavern placed their right fist over their heart. Club salute. This kid had just become family. "Doc," Hammer called to an older member near the bar. "Get over here." A man in his early 60s moved forward, gray beard, weathered face, gentle hands that had stitched up combat wounds in Vietnam. His road name was Doc, because he'd been a combat medic before he'd been a biker. He'd seen 19-year-olds bleeding out in rice paddies and somehow kept them alive long enough to get them home, keeping a hypothermic teenager stable until an ambulance arrived. He could do that in his sleep. Doc knelt next to Ethan, already assessing. "Son, I need you to tell me where it hurts most." While Doc worked, Hammer walked to the corner of the bar. He pulled out his phone, hit a contact labeled Ironside. 2 rings. "Hammer, you boys okay out there? Storm's getting bad." "Ironside, it's bigger than weather. I need every brother within 30 miles at Grayson's roadside tavern. Now." A pause. Just 2 seconds of silence that felt heavier than words. "What's going on?" 14-year-old kid just ran 2.7 miles barefoot through a blizzard to escape an abuse facility 2 miles east of here. Says there's 7 more kids trapped inside. Says he's got recordings of the facility director admitting to fraud and systematic abuse. We're not waiting for CPS to take their time on this one." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Say no more. We're coming." The line went dead. That was it. No questions about proof. No concerns about legal complications. No debate about whether this was their business. Just, "We're coming." Because that's what brotherhood meant. Hammer walked back to where Ethan sat, wrapped in blankets. The kid's shivering had decreased slightly. Doc's work. But his eyes still held that desperate look of someone waiting for adults to fail him again. "How many people did you try to tell?" Hammer asked quietly. Ethan's breath stuttered. "A couple who were leaving the grocery store, a soccer coach, 3 women from Bible study, church deacons who came to inspect the facility." "And what did they say?" "The couple said Pastor Thornwell was doing good work, and I needed to respect authority." Ethan's voice went flat, dead. "The coach. He looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. Then he called Pastor to report I'd tried to get help. I got 2 days in the isolation shed for that." Crow made a sound low in his throat. Hammer put a hand on his shoulder. "Not yet." "The Bible study women?" Hammer prompted. "They told me prayer and discipline were what I needed. That running from God's correction would harden my heart." A bitter laugh that shouldn't come from a 14-year-old. "And the deacons? They quoted Romans 13 at me, said rebellion against godly authority was rebellion against God, told me to honor my parents' decision to send me there." Wire, still on his phone, looked up. His jaw was tight. "Boss, I'm pulling state licensing records. Shepherd's Path passed its last inspection in September. No violations noted. Inspector praised Pastor Thornwell's dedication to faith-based rehabilitation." "How much warning for the inspection?" Crow asked. 48 hours. Standard protocol." Hammer's hands curled into fists. 48 hours. Plenty of time to turn on heat, feed kids normally, stage everything for appearances. "What happens before inspections, Ethan?" Hammer asked, though he already knew. "Pastor turns on the heat 3 days before. Feeds us normal meals that week. Tells us if we say anything about the real conditions, we go to the shed for a month. Ethan's voice dropped. Last time after the inspector left, he said we'd borne false witness by making him look bad. 4 of us got no food for 4 days as punishment for having wrong attitudes during the visit. The front door banged open. Paramedics rushed in with a stretcher and emergency equipment. Behind them, a Custer County Sheriff's deputy, young guy, maybe late 20s, looked around the bar full of bikers with obvious wariness. Hammer stood, making himself visible. He's here. Hypothermia, malnutrition, possible frostbite on extremities. Says he escaped from Shepherd's Path Youth Center 2 miles east. The deputy's face changed. Just a flicker. Surprise, then something else. Discomfort, maybe. Shepherd's Path? That's Pastor Thornwell's place. That's what he says. The paramedics were already working on Ethan. Blood pressure cuff, thermal blankets, checking his feet and hands. One of them, older woman with kind eyes, kept up a steady stream of reassurance. You're okay, sweetheart. We've got you. You're safe now. But Ethan's eyes never left Hammer's face. You promised, he whispered. The other kids. You promised. Hammer nodded once. And I keep my promises. The deputy stepped closer, voice low. Sir, I understand you want to help, but if there's a situation at that facility, we need to handle it through proper— How many times has CPS been called on that place? Hammer interrupted. The deputy blinked. I don't have that information readily. Guess. Hammer's voice was flat, cold. A long pause. Then, twice that I know of. Both times case closed as unfounded after investigation. And how long ago? Last one was July, I think. Anonymous neighbor report. Nothing came of it. Hammer looked at Ethan being loaded onto the stretcher. That kid had been starving since March. July investigation found nothing. September inspection found nothing. 2 failures in 5 months while a teenager lost 31 pounds and learned that no adult would believe him over a pastor's reputation. Deputy, Hammer said quietly, I served 8 years Marines, 2 Gulf War tours. I know what orders look like. I know what proper channels are. I also know what happens when proper channels fail. He pulled the plastic bag with the phone from his jacket pocket. This phone has recordings. Kid says it proves fraud and systematic abuse. Kid says 7 more children are still trapped in that building right now. Pastor Thornwell left for a church meeting in town at 5 o'clock p.m. He's expected back by 9 p.m. That gives us— He checked his watch. 6:37 p.m. 2 hours and 23 minutes before he returns to a facility where the only thing stopping him from destroying evidence and punishing remaining kids is a part-time staff member who's probably asleep. The deputy's hand moved toward his radio. Sir, you can't be suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's about to happen. In the next 10 minutes, every Hell's Angel within 30 miles will be rolling up to that facility. We will be documenting evidence. We will be ensuring those children's safety. And we will be waiting for you and your fellow deputies to arrive and do your jobs. What we will not be doing is waiting another 3 hours for CPS to return phone calls, while 7 kids spend another night in freezing rooms with a predator on his way home. Hammer's voice never rose, never threatened. He simply stated facts with the calm certainty of a man who'd made a decision and would not be moved. The deputy looked around the bar. 14 bikers staring back at him. Not aggressive, not threatening. Just waiting. He swallowed hard. I need to call my sergeant. You do that, Hammer said. We'll be at 1847 Redemption Road. Come find us. The ambulance pulled away with Ethan inside, siren cutting through the howl of the blizzard. Through the back window, Hammer saw the kid watching him, until the doors closed. 7 more kids. The front door opened again. This time it wasn't paramedics. It was motorcycles. Not 14 anymore. Not even 20. The rumble started low, distant, like thunder rolling in from every direction at once. Then it grew. Engines roaring even through blizzard winds, headlights cutting through sheets of snow. They came from the chapter house 23 miles away, from Omaha, from Grand Island, from North Platte. Word had spread through the network. A kid needed help, and the system had already proven it wouldn't provide it. By the time the sun set completely at 7:14 p.m., just 37 minutes after Ethan's ambulance left, 147 Hells Angels had converged on a small roadside tavern in rural Nebraska. 147 men who'd dropped everything to ride through dangerous conditions because a stranger's kid was in trouble. Ironside walked in last. He was 67 years old. Club founder, retired steelworker with hands that could bend rebar, but held his granddaughter like she was made of glass. He'd seen protests and riots and plenty of chaos in his decades. This wasn't that. This was discipline. "Hammer," he said simply. "What do we know?" Hammer laid out everything. Ethan's escape. The recordings. 7 kids still inside. Pastor Dew, back at 9:00 p.m. System failures going back months. When he finished, Ironside looked around the room at 147 faces. "All in favor of making sure those children are safe tonight?" The room went quiet, just the ticking of the clock on the wall and the muffled sound of wind battering windows. Then, slowly, deliberately, every single hand went up. Not a moment's hesitation. Not one dissenting voice. 147 men voting unanimously to help children they'd never met. Ironside nodded once. "Then let's ride." The convoy rolled out at 7:22 p.m. Now you might be thinking, 147 Hells Angels roaring up to a youth facility in the middle of a blizzard, and the first thing they do is start breaking down doors. That's the story you expect, isn't it? Chaos, violence, leather-clad vigilantes taking justice into their own hands. But that's not what happened. Because these weren't just bikers. Many were veterans, fathers, men who understood that the difference between justice and revenge was discipline. And discipline was exactly what 7 trapped children needed. The formation moved in coordinated rows, 4 bikes across, engines synchronized, headlights cutting through snow like search beacons. They'd ridden together for years, some for decades. Every man knew his position. Every man understood the mission. This wasn't a protest fueled by anger. This was a rescue operation with military precision. At 7:41 p.m., the convoy arrived at 1847 Redemption Road. Shepherd's Path. Youth Reformation Center sat back from the road, a converted farmhouse with an added wing that looked more like a prison block than a place of healing. No exterior windows on the residential section, just concrete walls painted institutional gray. A single light burned over the front entrance, the motorcycles parked in formation across the snowy driveway. Not blocking access, careful about that, but impossible to miss. 147 bikes lined up with mechanical precision. Engines died almost in unison. The sudden silence after all that noise felt heavy, expectant. 147 men stood beside their motorcycles, not moving toward the building, not shouting, simply present. Hammer was first to the door. With him, Crow, Doc, Wire, and a younger member named Preacher, former seminary student who'd left the church when his diocese protected an abusive priest. Preacher understood how religion could be weaponized. He'd seen it before. The door opened before Hammer could knock. A woman in her late 20s stood there, eyes wide. Part-time staff member, Hammer guessed. The one Ethan said usually fell asleep during evening shift. Can I help you?" Her voice shook. Hammer's voice stayed calm. "Ma'am, we're here to check on the welfare of the children in this facility. We have reason to believe they're in immediate danger." Behind them, 3 Custer County Sheriff's vehicles pulled up. The young deputy from the bar got out first, followed by 2 older officers and a sergeant who looked about ready for retirement. The sergeant, name tag reading Matthews, walked up to Hammer with the careful posture of a man trying to keep control of an unpredictable situation. "Miss Sullivan," he said. Apparently someone had provided names. "I understand your concerns, but you can't just—" "Sergeant," Hammer interrupted quietly. "We've done nothing illegal. We're standing on a public driveway. We haven't trespassed. We haven't threatened anyone. We're simply waiting for you to do a welfare check on 7 minor children who we have probable cause to believe are being abused." He held up the plastic bag with Ethan's phone. This device contains recordings that allegedly document fraud, abuse, and systematic neglect. The child who provided it is currently at County Hospital being treated for hypothermia, malnutrition, and frostbite. He says 7 more children are inside this building, being kept in unheated rooms with inadequate food. Sergeant Matthews looked at the phone, looked at 147 bikers standing silent in the snow, looked at the building with no windows. His jaw tightened. "Lisa," he called to the staff member, "I'm coming inside to conduct a welfare check. You're going to cooperate fully, or I'm going to have questions about why you're refusing." The woman, Lisa, stepped back. Her hands trembled. "Pastor Thornwell isn't here. He's at a church meeting. I don't have authority to—" "You have authority to ensure children are safe," Sergeant Matthews said. His voice had changed. Less bureaucratic, more human. "Show me the residential wing." What they found confirmed every word Ethan had spoken. 8 rooms, each 8 by 10 feet. Concrete walls, single bare bulb, thin mattress on the floor. 1 wool blanket per child, inadequate for Nebraska winter. The thermometer Doc carried read 43 degrees Fahrenheit inside the rooms. 7 children aged 11 to 16. 3 boys, 4 girls. All thin, all wearing layers of donated clothing that didn't fit. All watching the door with the same hollow-eyed wariness that Ethan had shown. None of them spoke at first. Doc knelt in front of a 12-year-old girl. His voice was gentle, the same tone he'd used on dying soldiers who needed to hear kindness one last time. "Sweetheart, my name is Doc. I'm here to make sure you're okay. Nobody's going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" "Lily." "Hi, Lily. How long have you been here?" 9 months? When's the last time you had a real meal? Not just soup or oatmeal. A real meal." Lily looked at Lisa, the staff member. Fear flickered across her face. "It's okay," Doc said softly. "You can tell the truth. That's what truth is for." Christmas. Pastor's wife made a big dinner for the annual report photos. That was 3 weeks ago. Wire was already documenting everything. Photos of the rooms, the thin blankets, the sealed heating vents, the padlocked kitchen pantry, the bathroom doors that had been removed from their hinges. The evidence was overwhelming. But what truly broke the case open was what Wire found in Pastor Thornwell's office: financial records, bank statements, contracts. State contract, $4,500 per month per child for residential behavioral health services. Parent tuition, $3,200 per month per child. Total income per child, $7,700 per month. 8 children enrolled. $61,600 per month. Facility operating for 3 years. $2,217,600 total received. Documented facility expenses. $287,000 over 3 years. Missing funds over $1,030,000. Where did the money go? Wire pulled up vehicle registration records on his phone. 2024 GMC Sierra Denali Ultimate, registered to Richard A. Thornwell. Purchase price $73,400. Bought 8 months ago. Crow found a folder labeled Personal in the desk drawer. Travel receipts. December 2024. Turks and Caicos. Mission trip documentation for tax purposes. Hotel, $4,200 for 1 week. Meals and entertainment, $3,800. Scuba diving excursions, $2,400. 0 documented mission activities. Boss, Wire called from the computer. Home renovation invoices, $86,000 in work completed last spring. Invoiced to facility as office upgrade, but the address on the contractor's final bill? That's Pastor Thornwell's personal residence on Maple Street, not this facility. The picture became clear. A man had built a business out of parents' desperation and state funding. He'd promised rehabilitation. He'd delivered barely enough food and shelter to keep children alive while pocketing the difference. He'd weaponized faith to silence complaints, and he'd been doing it for 3 years. But there was something else in that file cabinet. Something that made Crow's hands shake as he pulled out a manila folder labeled Previous Residence, Archive. Inside, insurance documentation from 2021. A previous resident, 16 years old, enrolled in the facility's first year of operation. 3 months in the program, then an insurance claim. Life insurance policy on the teen, purchased by parents as part of facility enrollment requirements, with facility listed as secondary beneficiary. Claim amount, $164,000. Cause of death listed on the police report. Accidental exposure hypothermia. Found in unheated storage shed during February cold snap. Facility claimed the teen had run away and gotten lost on property. Investigation closed after brief review. Facility received $28,000 as secondary beneficiary after parents were paid. Wire photographed every page. His voice was tight when he spoke. This isn't just abuse and fraud. There's a pattern here. This happened before. Sergeant Matthews looked at the documents. His face had gone gray. We need state investigators, and CPS, and the county attorney. Now. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -12 degrees. Wind chill made it feel like -28. Inside those 8 rooms, 7 children had been sleeping in 43-degree temperatures. Another week of this cold snap, combined with their weakened physical states from chronic malnutrition, and investigators would later testify that at least 2 children were at risk of serious medical complications. Ethan had escaped with maybe days to spare. The others might have had even less time. At 8:47 p.m., Pastor Richard Allen Thornwell's GMC Sierra pulled into the driveway. He saw the motorcycles first, then the police vehicles, then 147 men standing silent in his driveway while snow collected on their shoulders. He got out of his truck slowly, confusion on his face. The same pressed khaki slacks and button-down shirt he always wore, wire-rimmed glasses, neatly trimmed beard. He looked like every youth pastor in every suburban church in America. He was humming, actually humming something that might have been a hymn. Pastor Thornwell looked at Sergeant Matthews. "Officer, what's going on? Has there been some kind of— Mr. Thornwell, we need to talk. Inside." The pastor's eyes scanned the crowd, landed on Hammer. "I don't understand. Who are all these— Inside, now." They walked into the facility office. Hammer, Sergeant Matthews, 2 deputies, Crow, and Preacher. Pastor Thornwell sat in his desk chair, the expensive leather one that looked out of place in a facility that claimed to barely afford operations. Sergeant Matthews laid out the evidence. The rooms, the cold, the financial records, the recordings on Ethan's phone, which Wire had already begun copying for evidence preservation. Pastor Thornwell's face remained calm, almost serene. "Officer, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. These children come to us deeply troubled. Their families have tried everything." "Save it," Hammer said quietly. Thornwell's eyes snapped to him. "I don't believe I was speaking to you, Mr. Sullivan, Marcus Sullivan. And I don't care who you were speaking to. I care about 7 children who've been sleeping in 43-degree rooms while you drove a $73,000 truck. The financial management of this facility is none of your— It's absolutely my business," Sergeant Matthews interrupted, "when state and federal funds are involved. You received $4,500 per month per child from taxpayer money for behavioral health services. Where are the 8 full-time counselors listed in your contract? Where's the medical staff? Where's the educational programming?" Silence. Preacher leaned forward. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of someone who'd studied scripture for years before learning how it could be twisted. "Matthew 18:6, he said. "Whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for him to have a millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea." He paused. "You're going to wish you had that millstone, Thornwell." The pastor's mask cracked. Just slightly. "You have no right to come into my facility and—" "Your facility?" Crow spoke for the first time. His voice was rough, barely controlled. "Your facility. 7 kids sleeping in cells. You called them cells in one of those recordings, by the way. Did you know that?" Thornwell stood. "I think it's time for you all to—" "Sit down," Sergeant Matthews said. Not a request. "You're under arrest." The room went completely still. "On what charge?" "For starters?" The sergeant pulled out handcuffs. 8 counts of child endangerment, 8 counts of fraud, 8 counts of theft by deception, financial exploitation. And we're just getting started. State investigators will probably add more once they review everything. Thornwell's face changed. The calm mask shattered. "This is religious persecution. I run a faith-based facility. You can't—" "I can and I am." Sergeant Matthews moved around the desk. "Richard Allen Thornwell, you have the right to remain silent." They read him his rights right there in his leather office chair, surrounded by photos of himself shaking hands with local politicians and church leaders. Awards for community service mounted on the walls. A framed mission statement about redeeming troubled youth through biblical principles. All of it a lie built on starving children and stolen money. When they walked him outside in handcuffs, 147 bikers watched in absolute silence. No cheering. No celebrating, just witness. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. The children were being evaluated by paramedics who'd arrived with child protective services. 7 kids wrapped in thermal blankets, drinking hot chocolate, starting the long process of understanding that someone had finally heard them. Crow stood with Lily, the 12-year-old who'd spoken first. "You did good, sweetheart. Telling the truth. That was brave. She looked up at him. Ethan really made it out? He really did. He's at the hospital getting warm, getting fed, getting safe. Is he coming back? No, honey. None of you are ever coming back here. Lily started crying. Not sad crying. Relief crying. The kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for months and finally remember how to breathe. Doc checked each child's vital signs while they waited for transport. None were in immediate critical danger, though all showed signs of chronic malnutrition and would need careful medical monitoring. But they would survive. They would heal. Because one kid had been brave enough to run through a blizzard, and because he'd stumbled into a room full of strangers who looked scary, but turned out to be exactly who he needed. At 10:23 p.m., the last CPS vehicle pulled away with the children inside, heading to emergency foster placements where they'd sleep in warm rooms with full stomachs for the first time in months. Ironside walked over to Hammer. "You did good." Hammer shook his head. "Ethan did good. We just showed up. That's all it takes sometimes, showing up when the system doesn't." They stood in the snow, watching the tail lights disappear. Behind them, 147 motorcycles still sat in perfect formation. Nobody had left. Nobody would until they knew for certain those children were safe. Because that's what gentle giants did. They stayed. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Richard Allen Thornwell was convicted on 12 counts of felony child endangerment, 8 counts of fraud, 6 counts of theft by deception, and 3 counts of financial exploitation of vulnerable persons. The judge sentenced him to 23 years in state prison with no eligibility for parole for 8 years. His wife, Margaret Thornwell, pleaded guilty to 4 counts of child endangerment and received 6 years with parole eligibility after 3. The state revoked Shepherd's Path's license permanently. The building was later purchased by the county and converted into a community center with transparent oversight and windows on every wall. But that's just the legal ending. Justice was served, yes, but justice wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning of what happened next. Ethan spent 4 days in the hospital. The medical team treated him for frostbite. He'd keep all his toes, though 2 would have permanent nerve damage. They addressed his malnutrition with a careful refeeding protocol, slowly increasing calories to avoid refeeding syndrome. They treated his upper respiratory infection and monitored him for any organ complications from prolonged starvation. But the physical healing was only part of it. On day 2, Hammer showed up. Not during visiting hours. He'd simply called the hospital administrator, a woman named Janet Holloway, who happened to be on the board at Cornerstone Fellowship Church, the very church Pastor Thornwell had preached at for 17 years. She'd been the one to recommend Shepherd's Path to 3 families. She'd vouched for Thornwell's character. She'd told parents their troubled teens would find structure and godly guidance there. Now she couldn't sleep. Couldn't stop thinking about the recommendation letters she'd written. The conversations where she'd dismissed concerns because Pastor Richard is such a dedicated man. When Hammer called asking for special permission to visit Ethan outside standard hours, she approved it immediately. It was the least she could do. Hammer walked into Ethan's room carrying something wrapped in leather. Ethan was awake, propped up on pillows, an IV in his arm delivering nutrients his body desperately needed. He looked different already, color returning to his face, eyes less hollow. But when he saw Hammer, his whole face changed. "You came back." Hammer pulled up a chair. "Told you I keep my promises." He unwrapped the leather bundle. Inside was Ethan's mother's silver cross necklace, the one that had broken when he collapsed at the tavern door. Hammer had taken it to a jeweler in town, had the chain repaired, polished until it gleamed. "Your mom's going to want to give this back to you herself," Hammer said quietly. "But I wanted you to know we found it, and we fixed it." Ethan's hands trembled as he took the necklace. "My mom," she called. "She's flying in tomorrow. She kept saying she should have believed me, should have listened. She's crying every time we talk." She's allowed to cry. She's also allowed to make it right. That's what forgiveness looks like, not forgetting, but building something better. Hammer leaned back in the chair. "Ethan, I want to tell you what's happening with the other kids, because you asked us to help them, and I want you to know we did." Over the next 20 minutes, Hammer laid it out. All 7 children had been placed in emergency foster care within hours of the rescue. Crow, the former foster kid who'd aged out of the system at 18, was coordinating with CPS personally. He'd been through it. He knew which social workers actually cared and which ones just processed paperwork. He was making sure these kids got the good ones. Doc had arranged for all 7 to receive medical evaluations at County Hospital. 2 needed immediate dental work from neglect. 1 had an undiagnosed vision problem that explained why he'd been labeled learning disabled. All were receiving nutritional support and therapy referrals. Wire had scrubbed every news outlet and social media platform, making sure none of the children's names or photos appeared publicly. He'd filed copyright claims, sent cease and desist letters, worked with victim advocates to protect their identities. These kids wouldn't grow up with Google searches showing their worst trauma. Preacher had been meeting with each child individually, not to push religion, but to help them process the spiritual abuse they'd experienced, to separate the weapon from the faith. Some wanted nothing to do with church ever again. Some wanted to understand why adults had used God's words to hurt them. Preacher listened to all of it without judgment. And Ironside, he'd called the Nebraska State Legislature, demanded hearings on oversight of faith-based rehabilitation facilities. 3 state senators had already committed to sponsoring new legislation requiring unannounced inspections, independent oversight boards, and mandatory reporting training for religious facility staff. "The system failed you," Hammer said. "We're making sure it doesn't fail the next kid." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "The other kids, are they okay?" "They're getting there. Same as you. It'll take time, but they're safe. They're warm, they're fed, and they're believed." That last word hung in the air. Believed. The thing every single one of those children had needed most. 3 months later, Ethan stood in the Hells Angels Nebraska chapter clubhouse for his 14th birthday party. Not his 14th birthday. That had been in November, spent in a freezing room with watery oatmeal. But his first birthday, where he actually felt like celebrating. The clubhouse was decorated with streamers that Doc's granddaughter had insisted on hanging. There was a cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, because Wire had asked Ethan's mother what his favorite was. 73 people were crammed into a space meant for maybe 40. Ethan's parents were there. His mother hadn't left his side for more than a few hours since flying in that first night. His stepfather, the man who'd signed the papers sending Ethan to Shepherd's Path, had spent 3 months in therapy learning to face what his desperation and pride had enabled. The relationship was fragile, healing slowly. But it was healing. The other 7 children from the facility were scattered throughout the room. Lily was teaching Crow's daughter how to play pool. 2 of the boys were arm wrestling with younger club members, laughing when they inevitably lost. One girl sat quietly with Preacher, showing him drawings she'd made in art therapy. They saw each other once a month now, coordinated through CPS and the club. A support group for kids who'd survived the same nightmare and needed to know they weren't alone. Ethan had gained back 21 of the 31 pounds he'd lost. He'd started high school in January, behind academically from missed education at the facility, but catching up fast with tutoring Wire had arranged through the local community college. He'd joined the JV basketball team, made 3 friends who knew nothing about his past except that he'd had a rough year. He still had nightmares, still flinched at raised voices, still struggled to eat normal portions because his body had learned to survive on so little. But he was alive, and safe, and believed. Hammer walked over with a wrapped gift. "Happy birthday, kid." Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a leather journal with his initials embossed on the cover, and a letter. The letter was short. Ethan, you were brave when bravery mattered most. You ran through a blizzard to save yourself and 7 others. You trusted strangers when every adult in authority had failed you. You held on to truth when the world called it lies. This journal is for your story, not the one that happened to you. You don't owe anyone that story if you don't want to tell it. But the story you're going to write from here forward, the life you're going to build. We're proud to know you. Hammer and the brothers, Ethan read it twice, then looked up at Hammer with eyes that no longer held quite so much fear. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing up, for believing me, for keeping your promise." Hammer put a hand on his shoulder, the same gesture he'd made that first night, kneeling in front of a half-frozen teenager in a roadside tavern. "Thank you for being brave enough to ask." 6 months after that night in the blizzard, the state released a comprehensive report on faith-based rehabilitation facilities. 42 facilities across Nebraska were flagged for immediate re-inspection. 17 lost their licenses within 60 days. New legislation passed requiring unannounced quarterly inspections, independent medical evaluations for all residents, zero-tolerance policy for withholding food, heat, or medical care, mandatory video monitoring in common areas, private interview protocols for children without facility staff present, anonymous tip lines monitored by state investigators, not local authorities. The bill was nicknamed Ethan's Law by the media, though Ethan himself had asked to remain anonymous. Wire made sure that request was honored. Janet Holloway, the school principal who'd recommended Shepherd's Path, resigned from her position. But before she left, she implemented a new protocol. Any time a student returned from a behavioral facility showing signs of weight loss, injury, or psychological distress, an automatic investigation would be triggered. No more taking facility explanations at face value. Frank Kowalski, the mailman who'd given Ethan's cry for help note directly to Pastor Thornwell, couldn't forgive himself. He left his route, took early retirement, but he also began volunteering with a children's advocacy center, using his story as a cautionary tale in training sessions for mandatory reporters. "I chose to believe an adult over a child," he'd say, voice breaking. "I was wrong. Don't make my mistake." Dorothy Brennan, the 71-year-old church organist who'd heard children crying at night and told herself it was therapy, spoke at 3 community forums about the danger of blind trust in religious authority. "I chose comfort over courage," she said. "I chose not asking questions because questions felt disrespectful. But the only thing disrespectful was my silence." And Hannah Price, the former staff member who'd tried to report concerns and been threatened with a lawsuit, finally got her vindication. The state paid her $15,000 in recognition of retaliation she'd faced for whistleblowing. She used the money to start a nonprofit that helped other whistleblowers in religious institutions afford legal representation. Systems changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably. Because one kid ran through a blizzard and 7 strangers wearing leather decided showing up mattered more than staying comfortable. But this story isn't really about bikers or badges or courtrooms. It's about something simpler and harder than any of that. It's about the moment when you see someone in trouble and have to decide, is this my business? 47 people walked past Ethan in the weeks before he escaped. 47 people who saw a thin, bruised teenager and chose to look away. Chose to believe he deserved whatever he was getting. Chose to trust a pastor's reputation over a child's reality. And then one night, 15 strangers in a roadside tavern made a different choice. They weren't heroes looking for a cause. They were tired riders waiting out a storm, nursing coffee, and talking about nothing important. They could have called the police and gone back to their conversation. They could have decided it wasn't their problem. They could have trusted the system to handle it. But they didn't. They showed up. They stayed. They used their numbers and their presence to make sure those children weren't invisible anymore. Here's what I want you to understand. You don't need 147 motorcycles to change a story. You need one person who decides to pay attention. One teacher who asks a second question when a student's answer doesn't add up. One neighbor who reports concerns even when it feels awkward. One friend who checks in when someone cancels plans for the 3rd time. One stranger who stops instead of walking past. The system failed Ethan. The church failed him. Teachers, inspectors, deacons, coaches, they all failed him. Not because they were evil, but because they chose comfort over action. Reputation over responsibility. The easy assumption over the uncomfortable truth. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever tried to tell someone something was wrong and they didn't believe you, this story is for you. You weren't crazy. You weren't lying. Sometimes adults fail children. Sometimes systems protect predators. Sometimes the people who should help don't. But somewhere out there, someone will believe you. Someone will show up. Someone will stay. And if you've never been that invisible kid, if you've been fortunate enough to feel safe and heard your whole life, then this story is your wake-up call. There are Ethans everywhere. In schools, in churches, in facilities and foster homes and family households. Kids who try to tell adults something's wrong and get dismissed because the adult in question has a good reputation, or because speaking up would be inconvenient, or because it's easier to believe everything's fine than to confront something ugly. Pay attention. When a child hesitates before going home, when they flinch at loud voices, when they're losing weight, but everyone says it's just a phase, when their stories don't quite add up, but the adult's explanation sounds reasonable. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Report even when you're not 100% certain. Believe kids even when it means distrusting adults you respect. Stand with the powerless even when the powerful have better PR. That's what the men in this story did. They weren't perfect. Some had criminal records. Some had made terrible choices in their youth. Some were exactly the kind of people that Pastor Thornwell would have said needed biblical correction. But when it mattered, they chose courage over comfort. Action over apathy. The vulnerable child over the respected adult. And 8 kids are alive and healing because of it. Ethan's mother still carries the recording device in her purse. not to listen to, but as a reminder. She'd missed the signs because she'd wanted to believe her son's problems could be solved by someone else's authority. She'd chosen to trust a program over trusting her maternal instinct. She'll never make that choice again. Now, a year later, Ethan doesn't talk about that night very often. When he does, he focuses on one moment, the feeling of Hammer's leather jacket settling around his shoulders. The first warmth he'd felt in months. The first time in 11 months that an adult had responded to his cry for help with immediate action instead of skeptical questions. That jacket weighed maybe 3 pounds, but it felt like salvation. Not because it was magical, because someone cared enough to take it off and give it away. If this story moved you, here's what I need you to do. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video, because there are more stories like this, stories about the people society fears protecting the people society forgets. Comment below and tell me, who was your protector? Who showed up when the system didn't? Or what do you wish someone had done when you needed help? And if you're in a position to help someone right now, a kid who seems off, a neighbor who's too quiet, a friend who's pulling away, don't wait for someone else to handle it. You be the person who shows up. You be the person who stays. You be the person who believes. Because at the end of the day, that's all Ethan needed. Not a perfect hero, not a flawless system. Just one person who looked at a freezing teenager in a doorway and decided, this is my business. This is all of our business, and that's the only way anything changes. 3 years after that February night, Ethan Cartwright graduated high school with honors. He gave a speech at the Hells Angels Nebraska chapter's annual charity event, a fundraiser that had raised $147,000, $1,000 for every biker who showed up that night, to support child advocacy centers across the state. In his speech, he didn't talk about the abuse. He talked about the moment he collapsed in a tavern doorway and saw 15 leather-clad strangers turn into the family that saved his life. They didn't look like heroes, he said. They looked like exactly the kind of people Pastor Thornwell would have said I needed saving from. But they were the ones who saved me, because they understood something I'd forgotten after 11 months of being told I was a liar. That children deserve protection, not punishment. That hunger isn't discipline. That cold isn't character building. That suffering isn't a lesson from God. It's a crime committed by men. He paused, looked at Hammer sitting in the front row. And they taught me that courage doesn't always look like you think it should. Sometimes it looks like a scared kid running through a blizzard. Sometimes it looks like strangers choosing to care. Sometimes it looks like imperfect people making the right choice when it matters most. The room erupted in applause. 147 bikers, their families, community members, and 8 teenagers who'd survived hell and lived to build something better. Hammer didn't clap. He just put his fist over his heart. The club salute. Still family. Always will be. Because that night in the blizzard, a boy asked for help. And the bikers said yes. And that yes changed everything.